So if you want to take it off, by all means, do so. Yesterday was actually the 50th anniversary of the Israeli attack on the Arab airfields, and that was a preemptive war. And I think one of the things that I'm going to ask these two experts, if you don't know who Jim Carafano is, if you don't know who Mike is, I don't know why you're here. So, I mean, what's the point of introducing people that everybody knows and that are brilliant writers, long-term thinkers, people who've been around this town long enough to remember, well, it never really was normal, so. But one of the things I'm going to ask them after they make their initial presentations is, do you distinguish between a preemptive war, like the '67 war, and a preventive war, which is the topic here, and which, of course, would be the kind of war we could fight with the Koreans if we really send 3 aircraft carriers and we decide we want to start shooting and all the rest of it. Or many would argue what Iraq really was. The notion being that we believed, and I was one of them, that Saddam really had a nuclear weapons program. We were getting that from every intelligence agency in the world, by the way, and Saddam's own generals believed it. The issue was, in my mind, should we have waited a bit longer till Blix was finished, because he was finding something completely different. In any event, that was a preventive war. We were preventing something that we thought was going on. That would be the kind of war we would fight in Korea, right now at least. So is there a difference between a preventive war and a preemptive war, and what difference does it make if there is a difference? But let me start. I don't know which of you guys wants to go first.
Mike.
Okay, well, I think there's a consensus that Mike's going to go first. So off you go, Mike.
Thank you, Dov, and thank you, Jim, I guess. And nice to see you all. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be addressing this topic with so much expertise in the room. And of course, there are different ways at this question. I like the way, Dov, you teed it up with an example already, which is on our minds with the 50-year anniversary. I'm going to also use a couple of examples, including Iraq, but also North Korea, and North Korea in 1994. So I'm going to do a thought experiment about that, rather than an immediate assessment of where we are today. And yes, of course, there's, I think, a huge difference between preventive and preemptive war. And, preemptive is when you think you're about to be hit, and you're just getting in the first blow by somebody who's winding up to punch you. And preventive is when you don't like the overall course of history and where things are leading you in terms of structural correlations of forces, and you prefer to act sooner rather than wait to see what somebody else might do to you later. So I thought, again, rather than be too pedantic or theoretical, I would go back and revisit the 1994 Korea crisis, because it was quite instructive as we think about where preventive war might be relevant, because as at least I recall the history and try to stay current with it by rereading it and taking in new studies and new archives as they become available, Secretary of Defense Bill Perry was actually putting preventive war on the table. Bill Clinton might never have quite gotten there, but it was one of those funny things in life where somehow, without really coherent planning, we sort of wound up with a pretty good solution, because you had uber hawkish statements by Bill Perry, not really known for being an uber hawk, or at least not a recklessly, rhetorically inclined guy. And then you had Jimmy Carter in his latter-day peacekeeping efforts, or I guess not latter-day, he's still going, but nonetheless, Jimmy Carter went over and did a deal that he wasn't quite authorized to make with Bill Perry's threat on the table, and so we never quite ran out the experiment as to what would have happened if the first Kim was not willing to negotiate an agreed framework. Now, maybe in retrospect, we shouldn't have had it, and of course, we know what happened later. The North Koreans developed an underground uranium enrichment program in the late 90s, and then they withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2002 during the Bush administration, and so in the end, you could say it was a failure in broad strategic terms, although maybe it bought us some time. Maybe that's sometimes an underrated interim accomplishment. But leave that debate aside. I think it's worth going back and asking, if Jimmy Carter hadn't pulled a rabbit out of a hat, or whatever you think he did pull out of that hat with the agreed framework deal, then what would have been the right next step for the United States? Because at that time, and again, people may want to correct me on details later, but just let me go with this for now. But at that time, we think North Korea might have had one nuclear weapon. They had temporarily shut down their nuclear reactor and done perhaps a little reprocessing in the first Bush administration. And again, Doug and others may correct me on the details later, and maybe we know more at this point, but we thought they might have one. We were pretty sure they didn't have more than one, but we knew they had enough plutonium that had probably by now been created to make another 4, 5, 6. And that's essentially the 4, 5, or 6 they probably did make 10 years later once they withdrew. And we also know that, so they had a lot of contaminated fuel at one site. So it was too late to do an Osirak style or a 2007, Syria style attack on a clean reactor site that hadn't yet become radioactive. But you could ask, well, was it still worth the risk of spreading some radioactivity if we could have reliably prevented the North Koreans from developing a bomb or building any more than one for 10 to 20 years or whatever into the future, whatever time it might take them to get something else going underground. And I guess I'm raising this not to make a strong argument about what we should have done, because that's sort of pointless at this point anyway, but just to simply make the point that I think these are the kinds of conditions where it's a close call. So 1994 North Korea, to me, is where it was a close call as to whether preventive war would have been smart had we not gotten the agreed framework. Or maybe you might argue, even though, instead of getting the agreed framework, we should have gone back. I think that probably leans me towards thinking that at this point it's too late, but we'll come to that soon enough, I suppose, in the discussion. So let me just put that one example, that one thought experiment on the table. And then to just briefly add a couple of thoughts on Iraq 2003, and then I'll look forward to seeing what others think. I tend to think, and with Ambassador Bremer in the room and others who gave so much and contributed so much in that effort, I tend to think that, yes, if Saddam had had WMD, and yes, if we had been honest with ourselves that it was going to take 5 years with more than 100,000 forces and going to take a sustained state-building effort of the type the ambassador began and that others tried to follow through on, but which the country hadn't really been braced for or prepared for at the beginning, then I would say, and we all have our opinions on this, we've all thought about it a lot, obviously, then I think the Iraq War, 2003, could have been a justifiable preventive war. Again, pretty close call, and with all those caveats and conditions. I think we would have had to be braced for, 100, 150,000 troops for 5 years. I think that was a foreseeable requirement at the time. And I said so when I was on a panel with Chalabi in October 2002 at AEI, that I thought it was going to be 150,000 troops for 5 years if we did it, but it might still be worth doing if, in fact, the WMD were there. But I think it was foreseeable it would take that much effort. Where I was wrong was not to recognize that even if you put in that much effort, you still might fail, because Iraqi politics and society were so broken that I don't even think that, quote unquote, doing it right would have come anywhere close to guaranteeing a successful and stable outcome, nor do I think we're at a complete failure today. So there's a lot of room for gray and for debate, but I think it's worth putting another counterfactual on the table or thought experiment. If Saddam had WMD, and if we had prepared ourselves for the possibility of a big multi-year engagement, then in my judgment at least, that would have been a close call, but probably worth doing. And maybe I'll just leave those two on the table for now, because I think what they do is simply, give me reference points in my own thinking. Any kind of hypothetical or future preventive war scenario that I would contemplate, I would bear those two reference points in mind as cases where, whether you were, in my mind, slightly for it or slightly against it, those were sort of at the threshold of where it might be strategically advisable. The actual North Korea case of 1994, in which we don't get an agreed framework at the negotiating table, being case one, the Iraq case of 2003, in which Saddam did have WMD, and then we had to contemplate whether to forcibly disarm him. So that one's the more sort of hypothetical or modified scenario, being case number 2. And I'll stop there.
I'll just give you a subtext to case number 2, since I happen to have been there. Rick Shinseki, the Chief of Staff of the Army, testified that he needed 300,000. Several hundred thousand is the exact wording. Yeah, sorry. Rick Shinseki, the Chief of Staff of the Army, testified that he needed several 100,000 troops to do this right. Rumsfeld was furious. Rumsfeld thought that all Shinseki was trying to do was to get more money for the Army. In retrospect, what it really tells you is that it's not only an issue of determining whether the threat you think is there really is there, but also of determining, well, okay, if it's there, what do you need to do to deal with it? And the Shinseki-Rumsfeld debate shows you that you really have two sets of questions to answer in these kinds of contexts. Jim, over to you.
Great. So I agree with Mike. The one thing you always get if you do something at the Center for National Interest is that you can pretty much guarantee that.
Now you get good food. Come
well,
on.
Yeah, and you know, and ethnically diverse food at that. But you'd always would feel comfortable that if anybody around the table was the featured commentator, that you would feel that that was a quality, you know, presentation. So it really is, you know, pretty remarkable group, and it really is truly an honor to be here. And I feel much more comfortable down at the other end of the table. But I want to first of all, I want to, you know, say for the record that I'm morally opposed to preventative war. I'm a strong believer in the just war tradition. I think it's one of the greatest gifts that was given to Western civilization, and it's kind of taming the dogs of war and making something that makes humanity livable, and particularly in the world of nation states, I think the just war tradition is a moral imperative that should be upheld, and preventative war is obscene under the just war tradition. So I'm kind of against it. I don't have a problem with preemptive war, and actually I don't think legally in international law anybody does. It's anticipatory self-defense. It's, right, you're going to strike me and I hit you first. It's not an aggressive act. It's still a defensive act. I'm not a legal scholar, so, but I'd always looked at the Iraq War not as actually fitting into that paradigm, and maybe I'm in the minority there because the first Gulf War was a cessation of hostilities. It was not a peace treaty. So technically, the two sides were still in active conflict, and you could argue, whether there was WMD or not, that Saddam had abrogated his commitments under that. And so legally, technically, the United States and the participants in the conflict had a right to renew the conflict without a new declaration. So I don't actually think Iraq actually fits into that paradigm at all. I do think that Korea is a different case. I mean, we all know that there's no peace treaty with North Korea, but I think that you can't make whatever the word is, de jure or de facto case, whatever, over this many decades that war is still extant, and that if you attack North Korea today, that would be a new war. I think that's a fair judgment. So what I do want to focus on is what I think this administration will do, right? And how it kind of fits into their thinking. So I think preventative war is off the table for this president. I mean, when you hear where he talks about, you know, I don't believe in nation building, I don't believe in regime change, I think that reflects kind of a core attribute of Trump, which is, you know, from a business, I mean, I don't think Trump is strictly transactional. People say, well, he's just a businessman, he thinks of anything as a transaction. I don't think that's correct, but I do think at his core is, you know, and in part from his lifetime and his background is why would I undertake an enterprise which has completely uncertain outcomes, engenders enormous risks, and has very questionable benefits, which essentially kind of wars do, and regime change and nation building does. So I think there's something instinctually in this president that rejects doing that. So I don't think he would sign up for a preventative war. I just don't think it's in him. I mean, even if his cabinet thought it was a good idea. I think that partially holds true for preemptive action as well, but I think there's a larger reason why a preemptive military strike or a preemptive military war, regime change in North Korea and other things is unlikely. And I think it's, and there's two parts to that. One is because I don't think it fits with their strategy at all. And I do think the core of the emerging strategy is they focus on three critical regions of the world: Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Why those three key regions? Because those are three parts of the world where peace and stability matter. Not that they have to turn into the land of milk and honey or whatever, but where you really don't want a regional-wide conflict, because that is simply a significant enough risk to U.S. vital interests that it's impermissible. So you really don't want a large regional conflict or large regional destabilization in any three of those regions. And I do think that's kind of the core of the strategy. They can't afford to do a preventative conflict and sustain that strategy. They can't cover all three parts of the world and fight new wars. They can do sustained military operations on the level of Afghanistan, But taking on major new military operations would simply make the strategy untenable because they couldn't cover all three regions. And I think that's in there. And more importantly, if your goal is not to solve the world's problems, turn everything into the land of milk and honey, if your goal is just to not have large-scale destabilization in these regions, and create a modicum of peace and stability, you don't have to do regime change or preventative war or preemptive wars to do in any of those regions. So I don't even think it's on the table and on the cards. And then I'll just finish with this, which is militarily they can't sustain that. They cannot. The biggest risk that this administration has right now is not Trump's tweeting, despite what some people might think. It's the fact that if your strategy is to sustain U.S. presence in three regions, and I don't think these guys are isolationists. He's not about disengaging. I mean, I do think that they recognize that they have to be forward present in these regions to look after America's interests and demonstrably deter and stabilize regions. You can't do that on the defense budgets that they have. And it's not that it's all about hard power, because it's not. But hard power and soft power are complementary. And oftentimes when you have sufficient hard power in a region, it actually makes your soft power much, much easier. So if you look at the kind of the tasks that they've already set for themselves in terms of continuing their commitment to NATO, kind of leading this effort in the Middle East, deterring North Korea, establishing a stable relationship with China, they can't get there on the military that they have now over the next 4 to 8 years. And if you look at the budgets that they've laid out for themselves, if it's $600 billion plus inflation, that's not going to cut it. So they can't sustain the strategy they have now, and I think that's actually the greatest risk to their strategy, let alone start wars. Clearly, they could not afford major operational military commitments and be able to sustain presence in the other two theaters. They don't have the capacity and capability for that. So I just think it's strategically, it's just not in the cards for these guys. All right, thanks a lot. Good time.
The only issue is what happens when you get caught up in something. But there are a lot of folks here, so I'm not going to do the go around the room and then everybody forgets the names they didn't know before. Just when you're going to speak, tell everybody who you are. Doug, I saw your hand up first. No? Staple. But do tell everybody who you are, Staple.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Those are very good lead-off presentations. Two issues. Both examples that you cited, the 1994 Korea situation and the Iraq War, occurred during the post-Cold War period when the United States was the sole superpower, and essentially we could take military actions anywhere in the world without a real risk of another great power opposing us. Korea may have been a questionable case in 94 because any military action on Chinese borders, as we've known, we've miscalled the risks on that in the past. But my question is, if we're going to discuss this question, we need to broaden it. My recollection is that in the post-Cold War, post-World War II period, we had military people who advocated preventive war against the Soviet Union before they developed nuclear capabilities that would have made that unfeasible. And General Eisenhower rejected that because of the unknowable costs that would incur. Many observers think that we're moving away from the period when we were the sole superpower, and that now we can no longer assume that if we take a military action, such as preventive war, that won't bring in other major powers opposing us. So that's a factor that has to be factored into our thinking about it. The second question is, what are the responsibilities to the initiator of a preventive war for the collateral damage that is caused to other nations by those actions? We don't like to debate that issue in the United States, but from a moral standpoint, and you have, I think, correctly pointed out that there is a moral factor involved in the in preventive war. we have to consider that question in debating the question. I'll be interested in the views of the panelists on those two subjects.
Yeah, so the second one's the easiest, right? Because the concept of proportionality holds both in the decision to go to war and in the conduct of war, in which is war is inherently an evil act, and the only valid purpose to go into a conflict is to solve or, a greater evil than you're going to cause in actually fighting the war. So you do have to consider collateral effects in the terms of the impact that it has. And so supposedly the cause and the outcome of a successful conflict should be measurably greater than any, conflict and suffering that's caused to innocents in the course of the conflict. How you operationalize that's a good question, but that's the principle. I would frame the first question differently, because I still think we live in an age when the United States and China and the United States and Russia and even the United States and Iran and even the United States and North Korea are not actually looking to fight wars with each other and aren't likely going to be fighting wars with each other. But where I do take your point, and which again I think makes the argument that preemptive war is less likely, because the United States is stretched and kind of looking three ways simultaneously, I do think a serious strategic consideration is anything you're doing in one theory and invariably can affect in the other theater. So if the United States became overcommitted and distracted by one theater, then people could take advantage of another. And we actually have a really good example of that in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So we were so consumed with Iraq and the resources that we really didn't give the attention that we needed to Afghanistan because we couldn't do both well simultaneously. And I think that's a thing that the administration would take into account. The fact that if you're trying to maintain peace and stability in three regions and you have a Kosovo or a Bosnian incursion in one theater, the potential that somebody might raise something in another theater, not directly for a confrontation with the United States, but enough to distract you and stress you and pull you in multiple directions. Certainly somebody like, which again, we saw from Al-Qaeda, part of the reason for Al-Qaeda wanting to go into Iraq is they were losing in Afghanistan. It was the opportunity to create a new theater and to create new problems for the United States. So that's the way I would frame it.
Stapleton, thanks for your question and your great observations. I'm just going to fall back again on thinking about an example, but this time I'll update North Korea, and I'll think about North Korea 2017. And it's an example that sort of fits into both of your questions, because you have China as both another superpower and the neighbor. And it strikes me that what thinking in your useful terms would do is lead you to remember, have one more reminder of the importance of all the things that can go wrong. So any temptation you might have to say, oh, this is just, okay, it's not going to meet the immorality standard of, let's say I'm proposing this preventive action, a surgical strike against the North Korean nuclear facilities. And I've got Jim Carafano's admonition hanging in my mind that I have to stay moral. And so even if I'm allowed to do that somehow, I better not produce general war. But I persuade myself that I can avoid that, because half the time when people go after nuclear facilities, they succeed, and the thing stops right then, at least in tactical military terms. And so I try to persuade myself of that and go ahead and go after the nuclear sites, at least the ones I can identify or pretty sure I know the location of, but thinking in your terms is one more reason why I better be darn sure that I can keep it, a beautiful 6-day war or 1-day war, rather than some general threat of escalation, because the minute that this becomes general war, then the likelihood of keeping China out or of operating with indifference to what China's interests may be or whatever, or what its military responses may be, that goes out the window as well. So I think what you do is it's a very useful additional reminder of all the ways in which these things can often go wrong, and forces you to dwell on that a little bit more than you might sometimes be tempted to.
Let me just point out that I can only think of a couple of cases where a country went after a nuclear facility. And in both cases, Iraq, Iraq, and Syria, the Israelis knew there wouldn't be a response because the other side wasn't capable of a response. That's not the case in Korea. I mean, even if you leave China aside, if you're sitting in Seoul, you know there's going to be a response. And so that is yet another factor. I mean, who are you doing this against? Can you get away with it? It's not just a matter of the uncertainties. It's can you get away with it? And it's not clear that in the case of Korea we can. Jeff, just identify yourself.
Yeah, there's two cases I think that are quite interesting because they don't initially involve the United States. First was the 1956 Sinai War, which was an Anglo-French-Israeli war. But from the Israeli point of view, as I remember it, it was very much a preventive war because of the huge arms deal that NASA had struck with the Czechs and the Russians, and that over the years, that would include Tu-16 bombers, and I think they felt that in 1956, while there were terrorist threats, there was no imminent threat to Israel, but there could be 10 years from now, and that was one of the reasons why they were so found the Suez operation so appealing, because the British and the French had air forces that could bomb Egypt. And the second case, which I think demonstrates how disastrously preventive wars can get out of hand, was Saddam Hussein's decision to go to war with Iran. I mean, there was no imminent threat from Iran except an ideological one. And yet he felt that this was the time to use force while the Iranians were in a sense of turmoil because of the revolution and get this awful ideological threat out of the way. Well, you know, he failed. And it just shows that even if you have the huge advantage of surprise, you rally around a country that's nationalist and just had a revolution, you may lose.
These great points.
Yeah, we were just both plugging Michael Durant's book on the Suez operation. Was it, what's it called again? Ike's Gamble. Yeah, which is a great book read if any haven't read it. Really terrific.
Comments, anyone? You guys have silenced everybody. Oh, good, please.
Not for long.
Not with this audience, no.
Thank you. Chuck Pena. Good to see both of you, Jim and Mike. So, Mike, you used two examples that were nuke examples. So I may be putting words in your mouth or thoughts in your head here, but so the underlying assumption there is, what are we trying to prevent? It seems that you're saying we need to prevent, or if the decision is to engage in a preventive war, another country that we don't like for whatever reason from acquiring a nuclear weapon, which then implies that that they would use it, because that's why we would try to prevent it, because otherwise we're afraid that they would use it. So have we lost faith in deterrence and the strategic nuclear arsenal as part of that equation that makes preventive war, something more necessary when the nuke question comes into hand? Because I would argue, even if Saddam had WMD, what did we need to prevent? We couldn't have otherwise deterred or contained. Would the world have collapsed and gone apart on us if in fact he had WMD? So I think the question is, what is it we're trying to prevent if preventive war is on the table?
It's a great question, and it's always a judgment call, factoring in the nature of who you're up against, the nature of the specific leader or regime. But we have an example, which is what's happened in North Korea since '94. So you could say, okay, we're all still sitting comfortably around this table in Washington not getting attacked by nuclear weapons, and we could be sitting around a table in Seoul not being attacked by nuclear weapons. So let's hope deterrence works. It's an experiment that I'd rather not have had to run when you've got the Kim family in charge. And one of the reasons I'm so concerned, and again, this example helps make the issues vivid for me, is that Kim Jong-un not only is a young, inexperienced, impetuous guy, but he's killing off the advisors around him who might sometimes have a different opinion, which means that's exactly when somebody can be the most dangerous, when they can sort of fall in love with their own theory and they're unchecked and uncriticized by that. So I really don't like a Northeast Asia when North Korea has 15 to 20 nuclear weapons headed for who knows where does it stop. I bet you he wants 100. I see no reason at all to assume that he won't go for 100. And when he has 100 and he has nothing else that makes him money, by the way, at what point does he take a gamble on selling? Probably not to Al-Qaeda, because they're not going to have the $1 billion that he needs to get his economy doing better. I guess it is doing better already at the moment, so maybe he doesn't need this safety valve today. But at some future date, who would he be willing to sell 10 bombs to for $1 billion or $10 billion bucks if it's his only way of keeping his country afloat economically? So I really don't like the world in which we're relying on deterrence of Kim Jong-un.
So I never thought I'd be the pacifist on the panel with Michael Hanlon. So so there's this difference between policy and strategy, right? So policy is how you want. So okay, and I'm perfectly okay with a policy that says North Korea having nuclear weapons is intolerable, and I'm perfectly happy with a policy that says Iran having nuclear weapons is intolerable. But just because you have a policy doesn't mean you have a strategy to do that, right? And so I think our strategic goals in Northeast Asia are twofold. One is that there's not a war in Northeast Asia, because that's bad. And two is that North Korea can't threaten us with a nuclear weapon. And so when a strategist looks at that, it says, well, is there a suitable, feasible, acceptable way to achieve that goal? And my answer, if there's a suitable, feasible way to achieve those goals short of war, that you should adopt that. And I actually think through deterrence and conventional and nuclear deterrence and missile defense and sanctions, you can create a reasonable, suitable, feasible, acceptable policy way forward that you could think that you can achieve both those goals, and therefore I wouldn't be supportive of preemptive military action. And I do think that's kind of the way that the administration sees it. I didn't want to come back.
Just to
Go ahead,
clarify,
yeah.
I'm not advocating, 25-year too late preventive war in North Korea today. But anyway.
Well, thank you for that clarification. So one of the reasons why which we haven't discussed, which I'm very hard over against the concept of preventative war, is I'm very critical of the argument of R2P, like the right to protect, right? So the right, the legal, not just the right, but the obligation of responsibility to protect. Sorry, yeah, right. So, but not just the responsibility, but the legal requirement under international law for nations to intervene in other nations to prevent any manner of ill will, because I think that is a path to really undermining the state order and undermining the whole notion of just war theory. And so if you buy into the notion, if let's say you're a hard neocon and you buy into the notion of, well, I'm okay with preventative war, then essentially what you're saying is you're okay with R2P, which I think is in many ways a more dangerous path to conflict than the notion that we're going to attack North Korea.
Link, I think you had your hand up. Link over there. Link. No,
Other link.
the other Link.
Thank you both. Good presentation. So I want to pick up on what Jim just said. I'm Link Bloomfield. Sometimes we hear generals saying, as in Afghanistan and other places, we can't solve this problem by military means alone. Sometimes we hear foreign policy people say, if we ever do get in, as you just alluded, if we ever do get into a war with China or Russia, it's a huge strategic failure. It is just by definition a failure if you end up in general war, which implies that policy needs to get something done. So I guess the question is, can you talk a little bit about whether relying on military force or resorting to military force is in and of itself represents a failure of policy? And we've seen, for example, with the cruise missiles on the Syrian chemical establishment, a limited use of force, not taking out the whole Syrian Air Force, but a limited use of force that sent a message, that changed the psychology. And in an era where you have the Arab Spring and you have, omnipresent communications and you have the Maidan and you have public opinion playing such a heavy role, politics playing such a heavy role, can you just talk a little bit about whether there is more to be done, as there was during the Cold War when we couldn't possibly go to war with the Soviet Union, so we had a few proxy wars on the margins, but we had to be much more clever and resourceful to achieve political end states. Can you just say something about that? I know it wasn't the subject, but...
Well, excellent question. And again, I'm going to just fall back on an example because I'm not capable of extrapolating to broader. There's not going to be a general theory of any of this for me. So it's always going to have to boil down to specifics. And so if I look at Syria today, and you refer to it, Lincoln, I do worry that President Trump has sort of had two ideas, which, by the way, are no worse than anything the Obama administration did, or no more simplistic. But he seems to be dangerously close to being content with them, which one of them was the cruise missile strike in retaliation for the abomination by the Syrians, which is just one of the many types of abominations they've committed, but the one he chose to respond to. And then on top of that, Trump has sort of stepped up what Obama was doing, just sort of the next level. The same way Obama himself had been gradually intensifying the air campaign, now providing weapons to the Kurds, controversially, but with the anti-ISIS focus of his campaign, but still no overall framework for solving the Syrian civil war. And unless we have that, I'm dubious that anything else can work. So what I'm worried about not having the kinds of contacts into this administration that I wish I did, not the frequent communication channels, is I'm not sure how much more thinking about Syria they're doing right now. And to the extent that at least the senior part of the White House is content with what's been done so far, stepping up the anti-ISIS fight and using the cruise missiles, that would in fact be inadequate. And that would reflect, and it's possible that the Pentagon, even though people like General Dunford and Secretary Mattis, I believe, are capable of thinking in integrated strategic terms, they may not feel that it's their portfolio or their purview to start thinking, let's say, about alternative political frameworks for a post-conflict Syria, which is the kind of thing I would advocate: devolution of power, regionalism of some kind or another, a more gradual strategy for inducing Assad out rather than thinking we can either negotiate him out or bomb him out, neither of which I don't think is going to happen. So I would welcome that, but I don't know that you can count on Mattis or Dunford to feel the prerogative to take the lead, given that we have something called the State Department, civil-military relations with a constitution that puts the civilians in charge. So I don't see Mattis and Dunford pushing that debate. So I do worry that in that kind of a case, that yes, we are guilty of what you worried about.
Yeah, I just want to go on the record of saying I hate Joseph Nye. No, I mean, I gotta be honest, I actually never read the book, but we got into this Manichaean debate about soft power versus hard power, which is just a nutty kind of stupid way to look at the world. That first of all, they're not fungible, right? So one doesn't substitute for the other, and one can detract from the other, or they can be incredibly complementary. And we simply need, as a model of American statecraft, to get beyond kind of these stupid arguments about, if we just had more diplomacy, we'd fight less wars, and if we just, were less warlike, we wouldn't have problems. I mean, the reality is all the instruments of national power matter, and they matter in the context of the competitor that you're competing with at the time. And to look at them in anything other than a holistic manner, I think is simply incredibly unhelpful. So to kind of build on Mike's point, knowing people in the administration, the administration, I really believe, in the NSC and in the cabinet, gets this. They understand that there is more to stabilizing the region and dealing not with just the defeat of ISIS and the defeat of ISIS and Al Qaeda, but also in a sense containing Iran, which they kind of define as kind of the two problems in the region. That there's more to that than just taking the black flag down in Mosul. And it's more than just a kinetic operation. Everybody gets that. And people actually, to be honest, the last administration got that. I mean, as they were going out the door, they were thinking about that too, right? But it's a really hard problem. And I think the answer is they recognize that, and there are lots of pieces, and they have to work through all those, and they're not done yet. And they do have a problem is that they don't have near the depth of staff on board to really grapple with those things. But these problems aren't going away anytime soon. So I think it's actually unrealistic to think that they're going to come out with a really complete and full plan for a couple of months yet. I mean, I think it'll be probably August and September before there's anything resembling like a real cadre of people on board for that. And it may not unfold in one grand sweeping plan. It may unfold kind of a piece at a time, but I think they have to do that. I mean, they're not stupid. I mean, they knew that empowering the Syrian Kurds to help take Raqqa created as many problems as it solved. But like the Obama administration would have a similar thing. Their priority was the physical defeat of the caliphate. Got that. But then there's ISIS 2.0 and Al Qaeda and Syria, and then there's Yemen and Somalia and Libya, and what do you do with Iran? And they know that's all on the to-do list, but it's a lot to work through. So,
Yeah, you're next.
And I do want to, you are right about one thing. Interestingly enough, the military guys, McMaster's, Dunford, Mattis, are the guys that most understand that it's just not a kinetic solution, which is,
I'm Dave McDermott. I'm the defense editor for this magazine. So my question is basically kind of based off what you said about RGP, Jim. With Kosovo and also Libya, I mean, we kind of sort of set the precedent that, we're going to undermine the Westphalian system. In some ways, we've actually kind of created our own problems here because, like North Korea, for example, a lot of the reasons they're developing nuclear weapons is because they're afraid that we're going to intervene. I mean, it's kind of like a chicken and egg scenario here. Are we kind of causing our own problems by doing this sort of thing around the world where we see a new threat, we threaten some sort of preventive measure to prevent them from acquiring a new weapon or whatever, and then we invade, or such the case was in Iraq, and thereby cause our own problem, essentially.
I mean, I do agree with the premise that North Korea has nuclear weapons, that the primary purpose of nuclear weapons is to sustain the regime. I think that's true. I mean, I think it's very simplistic to say, well, because somebody did something that, somebody else did that, right? So would North Korea pursue that path regardless of whether the Kosovos or the Libyas of the world? My answer is probably yes, they would have. So it's kind of irrelevant just because they're evil people. I would say personally, I wasn't in favor of Kosovo, and I wasn't in favor of Libya because I did think it set bad precedents.
Just pick up on one point, and again, I know Paul Bremer does.
Although I love
others.
Kosovo, it's a wonderful country.
Exactly.
It's great people. Glad they got their freedom.
In Iraq, after the U.S.-led invasion of 2003, there was, of course, an Iranian response, and a lot of Americans died at the hands of weapons that were built by Iran, and which I think partly explains the depth and strength of feeling of people like Secretary Mattis and General McMaster as you see the Trump administration fill out its Iran thinking. But for a couple of years after the invasion, and again, I hope others who have more expertise on this than I will chime in if they think I get it wrong or want to add. What people wondered, well, is Iran doing this out of partly defensive motive because they've read George Bush's Axis of Evil and preemption speeches and national security strategies, and they know they could be next. And I wondered for a while if that might be true, and then I decided by about 2006 or 7, it obviously wasn't true, that Iran was pursuing its goals way beyond any kind of realistic or reasonable reading, unless they were just really bad at reading us. Because, or unless I got it wrong, because I think by 2006, 2007, George Bush was not in the mood to invade anybody else, especially a country 3 times the size of Iraq. So the notion that Iraq had to be somehow destabilized by Iran in order to make sure the Americans didn't have the resources to then turn east, I think, if that was ever a semi-plausible theory in the time Ambassador Bremer was in Iraq, it was no longer credible at all a couple of years later, and yet the Iranians kept it up. And in fact, they had been doing it before 2003, and they're doing it way after. So there may be certain countries that look at American action, and I do think Vladimir Putin interprets our actions as being sort of hyperpower, superpower out of control, and he enjoys pushing back and slowing us down in his own Machiavellian and ruthless ways. But with the Iranians, I think they're after regional influence, and the fact that we're there or not is almost secondary.
Okay, Marvin, I think you're next. Over here.
Thanks. Marvin Ott, formerly federal government, now Hopkins and the Wilson Center. This is basically a question about what can policy do is the main part of the question, but just a precursor, just a historical point for Mike. When you look at the collapse of the agreed framework strategy, my reading of it, and it's not informed in great detail, was that a lot of that lay at the feet of the incoming Bush administration and the attitude they took to North Korea. In other words, it strikes me as important to have a pretty clear notion of historically what happened. Was the agreed framework actually viable? Would it have survived, and would it have created a very different geostrategic set of circumstances had the incoming administration, George W. Bush, handled it differently? That's a question. I don't know the answer to that. And the sort of policy point, and again, sort of a question, I'm not a techie, but I worked for an organization that no longer exists years ago, the Office of Technology Assessment. So I spent 7 years working with, biochemists and nuclear engineers and people like that. And I gained an appreciation for what technology can do. And I'm wondering about missile defense. It was mentioned just in passing, but, there are no silver bullets and all of that. Nevertheless, then there are people, maybe the man sitting on my left can answer this better than anybody else. What can we possibly actually do on the missile defense front that will actually change this strategic equation fundamentally. Basically take the missiles out of Kim Jong-un's hands.
Maybe I'll leave the second to you, Jim, but I'm a skeptic that we're anywhere close to that. I'll just say that much. But I'll go back to your first question, and I know Doug, Paul, and others are in the room on this. I think the North Koreans were beginning to violate the agreed framework by about 1998. And is that roughly, and I think, therefore, that whether you agree with Bush administration North Korea policy or not, that the policy or the goal of the negotiated framework had already gotten well on its way towards failure by that point. And so I think that one can look back on the way in which, if you're going to look for anybody in the West to blame or say that we contributed to the problem, in the late 90s, of course, the Clinton administration attempted the Perry process where they were trying to give North Korea more inducements, which had been part of the concept of the agreed framework. But along the way, what had also happened in the mid-90s, the North Koreans did things, wasn't that when the submarine special forces guys came ashore and 10 of them wound up getting killed inside of South Korea by South Korean forces? They obviously had some pretty serious intentions in mind to have 25 special forces coming into South Korea. And you know, on top of that, there were problems of, as there often are, problems between Seoul and Washington in coordinating strategy, because you had a harder line South Korean president at that period. And so I don't know that Washington and Seoul ever managed to get their arms together around a combined strategy of carrots and sticks. But beyond that, I think the bottom line is the North Koreans just cheated. And you know, maybe they considered themselves to sort of be cheating politely in the late 90s, and then they cheated overtly and, you know, egregiously in the 2000s. And, you know, maybe you can get into whether the Bush administration could have handled that differently. But they were already well on the way towards violating that treaty by 1998 or so.
I would just add, and Doug can correct me, but as I recall, remember when we came in 2001, we actually were saying we don't want to get involved the way Clinton did. You know, we didn't want any more Kosovos and all this sort of thing. And so if you were sitting in Pyongyang, it wasn't us that was encouraging you to do anything. They were moving ahead anyway. And then once they moved ahead further, we responded. But until 9/11, George W. Bush wasn't inclined to go jumping into other messes.
So I love Herman Kahn.
You hate Joe Nye.
I hate Joe Nye. I love Herman Kahn. It says it all. It is. It's true. So while Curtis LeMay lost the preventative war debate, and that was kind of off the table as an offensive measure, that was then replaced by the deterrent, essentially, the Schilling argument of kind of massive, which essentially a mutual assured destruction, massive retaliation. So the great debate was between Kahn and Schilling, and Kahn advocated for a different strategy, which was kind of a protect and defend strategy, which was an offense-defense mix. And the argument was offense-defense mix is more stable than an offense-only strategy. The problem with the Kahn strategy is the only defense that was capable, since missile defense really wasn't practical. The only missile defense we had was to shoot a nuclear weapon and blow up a nuclear weapon and have it fly through the nuclear weapon. And people decided that wasn't such a good idea. Was essentially build bomb shelters, put your industry underground, you're resilient, take massive casualties, right? And for fiscal reasons, among other reasons, that was rejected, and essentially our nuclear strategy is evolved as an offensive strategy. And what missile defense essentially did was, was the strategic recalibration, which is it allows you to have this offensive-defensive mix. And I think our work argues is that that's inherently a more stable strategic environment, that you're actually less likely to have conflict. That the belt and suspenders approach is actually better because the other guy is more deterred. Because not only is he worried about retaliation, he's worried about that his initial attack might not be successful to begin with. And that's a more stable deterrent. And from the defender's point of view, the notion is that if you think you have the capability to shoot a missile down, a limited number of missiles, then you're actually less likely to act preemptively, thinking the only choice I have is to attack them first or try to take that facility out. So for a limited nuclear threat like North Korea, I mean, not missile defense doesn't have to be perfect. It'd be nice if it worked. But that a combination of offensive defensive capability is perfectly suitable for deterrent, particularly when you have a regime which, at the end of the day, I truly believe is not interested in having a war with the United States. What they're interested in doing is being able to threaten the United States and blackmail the United States and affect U.S. international behavior, but they aren't actually interested in nuclear exchange, because at the end of the day, if the purpose of the North Korean nuclear weapons is to ensure the permanence of the regime, then the last thing you want is a war, because it's the one thing that you absolutely will guarantee the end of the regime. So it doesn't make any sense. But I do think that a deterrent-only strategy is actually less credible, because essentially what you're saying is we're going to destroy this entire country of 999,000 starving people with no shoes who didn't do anything to kill 5 people, right? I mean, morally, it just doesn't, I think, cut the mustard. But the notion of we do have the capability to retaliate with a nuclear weapon, but we also have the capability to protect ourselves, that actually leads to a much more stable environment. And I would actually be a lot less sanguine if we didn't have missile defense capabilities about the notion, well, let's just deter them with nuclear weapons. Because then you have the problem is, well, what happens if there's an accidental launch? I guess I'll tell a story real quick. We war gamed this a couple years ago, and when we did the beta test, we had our interns play the countries, and they played North Korea. And so we had this kind of offense-defense thing. And so in one turn of the game, they fired 1 nuclear weapon at the United States. And in the next turn, I fired like 8,000 nuclear weapons. And they go, oh my God, why did you do that? They go, that 1 nuclear weapon, that was a warning shot. And I'm like, kids, we don't use nuclear weapons for warning shots, So, I mean, you never want to create a scenario where somebody thinks that they can, steal a march on you. And I think missile defense provides that edge. And it's not just because I work at the Heritage Foundation, and we famously love missile defense. But, actually it is. No, I'm sorry. But I do think that it has been. I think it's already been a game changer. Is I guess my answer. So
well, at Brookings, we love missile defense so much that we stole one of your buzzwords for our title of a book I did 15 years ago on defending America.
Right.
Yeah, and
right.
and I think you made a very beautiful, convincing, passionate argument for why we should have a limited missile defense against North Korea, even if it might not work that well, and the offense-defense numbers don't work against a bigger threat right now. So I'm fully on board.
We do have one concrete case, again, of where this is no longer something that's theoretical. The Israelis are spending a hell of a lot of money and now have 4 levels of missile defense. Now, why do they have 4 levels? It's very simple. If you run the probabilities, and even if the PK of a missile, of killing a missile is down to about 0.7 or 0.65, once you've got 4 sets of defenses, the probability that a missile is going to get through is less than 0.001. Now, if you're sitting in Tehran, and you know that you've got that low a percent of your first missile coming through, but the percentage of the Israelis taking out Iran is 100%, you're not going to do it.
And I would argue that's actually made the Israelis more conservative. So when the Hamas starts launching missiles, the politicians aren't sitting in Tel Aviv trying to explain to their people why they can't defend them. But the fact that if they can do a reasonable job of defending them, then that limits the pressure to what we have to go into Gaza again and clean these guys out.
Yeah. You had a microphone over here, please.
Back to North Korea.
No, you just have to tell us who you are, of course.
Don Smith, Ben's member and ex-banker. But are we? It seems to me that some of the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe methods worked on Eastern Europe, certainly in Cold War days. Are we expending those kinds of methods in North Korea? And if we did, would they work?
I'm going to mostly give the question to Doug or somebody else who might know more. Yeah, why don't I just do it now instead of embarrassing myself first?
Doug, you can join the panel.
Yeah, there's Doug Paul from Carnegie Endowment. There's a tremendous amount of activity on that score, but it's all privately driven, mostly by Christian organizations. Korea has an interesting history where the Japanese wouldn't educate during the colonial period. Christian churches came in, provided education. Lots of really passionate Korean Christians. And many of them have taken on the missionary duty of using every kind of social media tool, every kind of new technology to get stuff into North Korea.
But these are South Koreans. South Korean Christians.
Although a lot of them are actually people who were originally North Koreans, or
yeah.
families from North Korea, because there was more Christianity in North Korea than in the South. historically. So that's happening. I just gave a speech in Korea last Thursday where I said we've got to really step up our covert action. The model is not similar, but the model is conceptually, I think, appropriate, which is what Reagan, Casey, and the Pope did in the 80s in Eastern Europe. But this time we have to upgrade the technologies. We need to work with China. Chinese control all the internet access to North Korea. There's a lot of potential cooperation if we can get past our inhibitions about each other in doing this. So I think there's, we're not going to broadcast, like Radio Free Asia and RFE are, you're not talking about the television age or the computer age or those things, but we can move it up and do more of that. The U.S. government, I think it's fair to say it's really under-resourced on this, and we really should be putting a lot more money into it. It's still small in the grand scheme of things, amounts of money. More money has gone into interfering, it's called left of launch, interfering with the launch of through radio waves on Russian, North Korean missile launches. It's had some success there, but we have more we can do.
You know, I would also point out that we don't have a Reagan, we don't have a Casey, and we have a very different Holy Father. And quite honestly, that this kind of thing does come from the top. And when you don't have those kinds of people at the top, you just can't expect more. It's just the reality of it. I have Chet next. All the way in the back there.
Thanks. Chet Crocker, Georgetown University.
Jerry?
I want to broaden the discussion a little bit, as picking up on what Jim said about the R2P, that is the responsibility to protect. We've got to think through, I think, pretty carefully what it is that we're trying to prevent with preventive action, preventive war. And we've talked about states going nuclear. That's one option. We've talked about changing regimes that we don't like. That's another case. We've talked about humanitarian emergencies. That's a third case. We've also talked about dismembering states that we don't like because of the way they behave to a certain portion of their territory. And, of course, Kosovo is the leading case there, but also Sudan, which has been dismembered by the conscious decision of American policymakers, and we now have a catastrophe in South Sudan that nobody's prepared to occupy or invade or take over, whatever. So I guess the question I'm raising is, how can we get a little bit better? And I ask this to both Mike and Jim. How can we get better at preparing for the day after? How can we institutionalize that? Is there something we can do to actually force that issue forward in our policy debates and our strategy debates? Because if you look at the Libya case, we have destabilized a huge chunk of Africa, to say nothing of the Mediterranean, by what we authorized, which came after the British and the French pushed for it. The Libyan case just destabilized an entire sub-region. And it's irresponsible, it's outrageous what we've actually done. I've actually heard African leaders plead for NATO to come back and take Libya over again so that they don't have to deal with the after effects. End of speech.
One of you guys want to take it?
Okay.
I'm going to have something to say.
Yeah, I'll start, and Doug has something to say, and he may have more to say after the case I'm going to invoke, because he did amazing work with limited resources in Afghanistan from 01 through 04, and then, of course, we stayed with modest resources for a couple of years thereafter. I still am, Kosovo, I would score a success, but sort of almost an accidental or inadvertent success. Ivo Dalder and I wrote a book called Winning Ugly, NATO's War to Save Kosovo, because it was so ugly at first. But the main thing was it was tiny. It was tiny, and we had so many Western resources to deploy against it, so the Shinseki-Rumsfeld debate didn't have to happen. We just went full-bore Shinseki times 10. And normally you're not going to have that kind of opportunity. So the question that's on my mind is, was there a way to learn from maybe what we could have done, should have done in Afghanistan between 02 and 07, if we had given Dove the kind of resources he really needed to sort of not do a light footprint, but a medium footprint, so that the heavy footprint might not have been necessary. In other words, build up Afghan institutions when the Taliban threat was low, so that they were better prepared to deter and or deal with it. That's just one example, but it's one that I'm fascinated by, and I hope somebody writes a good study on it someday, and I haven't really seen that study yet, but my instinct is something in the range of 50,000 well-resourced soldiers with a good state-building program might have really done what was needed in Afghanistan in that era, and that might then point the way towards what to do now about Libya, for example. One more case, and I'll stop. I'm not advocating this today because I don't think that President Kabila in the DRC has any chance of being successful with this strategy. But if we get to a new president in DRC, which is my old Peace Corps country, so I have a special place in my heart for it, and we could incentivize or somehow cajole and push Kabila out, then I would be in favor of, and Jay will hate this probably, but be in favor of considering deploying a U.S. Advise and Assist Brigade to the UN peacekeeping mission in DRC to try to get the Congolese military to the point where someday it can do some of this job on its own. Because right now the UN approach is sort of like a Band-Aid, just holding things together, preventing Eastern Congo from blowing up again. But there's no capacity to speak of that's being developed indigenously. And we've learned a lot about how to do these Advise and Assist Brigade things correctly, even though the results have been imperfect in the Middle East. And I think it's also what the Trump administration is deliberating on now. Do we send more advisors out into the field in Afghanistan? But someday I would be in favor of considering that option for DRC or a country like that.
Well, in terms of resources, yeah, we didn't have enough for Afghanistan. There was a reason for that. A lot of that got diverted to Iraq, as simple as that. And that opens up a whole other debate. But it seems to me also that it's not just the 50,000 soldiers. Where is the State Department? Where is AID? When I was doing the Afghanistan thing, I would have these meetings and I'd bring in AID people and state people. Some of my colleagues at DOD thought I was a turncoat for doing that, I have to tell you, which is, to me, the biggest problem. If we're at war with ourselves, as we were over Iraq in particular, we're never going to win any war. And do we have the institutions at state? State tried with John Herbst and that whole little thing. A complete failure. Not a 99% failure, 100% failure. And so the question is, can state get its own act together, and then get the resources so that at some point the guys in uniform and the women in uniform hand over to these people? You've got some people at AID already, the OTI folks that are actually sometimes out there with the troops. And a lot of these are young people, by the way, for AID's crazy reasons, cannot become part of AID because they're officially consultants. So they don't, even though they're being shot at, they don't have the experience for AID. Go figure that one out. But unless AID, which right now is being cut, I understand, and state, which right now is being cut, I understand, can figure out how to backstop and then take over and work with allies on this, who very often know a hell of a lot more than we do about the countries we're talking about, we're not going to get anywhere.
So I have a crazy idea, so don't look at me like I have a third horn. So for starters, the administration has an answer for that, is we're just not going to do that, right? So there is a great reluctance to take on these kinds of missions. And, even like in the Middle East, there's plenty of acknowledgement, I think, and willingness in terms of like stabilizing refugee populations and working with NGOs and everything. There might be actually some appetite, administration, I don't know, so don't quote me, for after, potentially putting some kind of U.S. advisory effort back into Iraq, right? We'll get a decision on Afghanistan. So, right now they can't resource train and assist down to the brigade level. So if they just had at least another 5,000, at least they could get down to brigade level, which would make military operations usually more efficient. So there might be some appetite in the administration for some kind of this thing, but they really don't have an appetite for this stuff. So their answer is, we're not going to do Libya's. That would be their answer. So, which is a good answer, right? Particularly for the strategy that they're trying to accomplish. But of course, the problem is the enemy gets a vote, right? And so the notion is, I'm never going to have to ever do this again, like the Vietnam thing. So problem solved, right? The problem with that is you might have to do it again. So we're talking about North Korea. Say, yeah, let's get all the Christians riled up, and great. And then North Korea collapses, and now we have the largest humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century, and everybody's in there. Chinese, South Koreans, Americans, we're all in there trying to keep this place from starving to death, right? So I think it's a bad bet for a global power with global interests and global responsibilities to bet the farm that it's never going to have to do something on a large scale again. I just think that's stupid. Because we've made that bet going back to 1776, and it's never turned out. We even tried occupying Canada for a period. That didn't work out so well. So every and if you haven't read Nadia Shadlow's on this book on this, it's really good, other than the fact that she didn't talk about Austria, which is the most important case study. But that's okay, because I wrote a book on Austria. But it's a really, really good book. But one of the real lessons learned from the book is we as Ambassador Bremer will tell you, what happens is we wind up in a case where we have to do this because our strategic interests require it, and we ad hoc our way through it. And sometimes we're very successful, and sometimes we're not very successful, right? So my argument would be, hey, why don't we try to figure out how to make if we do have to do this someday, kind of do this less stupid, right? And the problem is that none of the instruments of national power that we have can scale to this mission, right? The people that have special forces can't do it, civil affairs can't do it, State Department can't do it, USAID can't do it. You can never afford to maintain, even on a warm base, the capacity and the capability to do this, because it's just too extraordinarily expensive. You know, some of this can be done by NGOs, but they have their own agenda, and it's not going to align with that, right? And so my argument would be, you know, the way you could minimize risk in this is if you had a cadre of people that is large enough and had the skill sets of working with NGOs and civil affairs and military thing, that, and you kind of had this big Rolodex that you could tap into if you needed, that might work. And so my argument for this would actually be to put this in the U.S. Army Reserve. And here's why I say that. One is, you don't have to create an organization. You already have an organization that knows how to keep track of people, pay them, keep track of their records and everything else, you know, make sure they have their dental stuff and whatever. So you have a place, in a sense, to house people. Then if it's an actual mission, that the military will write doctrine and have training standards and other stuff for that. And then if you actually ever needed to mobilize this cadre, you have a lot of flexibility. You could mobilize them, you could throw a uniform on them and send them in the field. You could loan them to the State Department and they could hire them as civilians. You could detach them to a contract or whatever. You have lots of options in how you could deploy that workforce. So I think a model like that might actually work. And the other thing is I think we have to get, and I think this is a point in Nadia's book as well, which I really believe. If it's a scenario where we're going into a conflict environment where reestablishing physical security is a primary concern in the process of, and I don't believe in nation building. I think nations rebuild themselves. What you do is you conduct a successful occupation, you create the baseline of governance and civil society and economics and security, and then, you know, things happen after that. But going into that environment, you have to have not just unity of effort, you have to have unity of command. And I think that that's got to be a military person. I actually think we stumbled on the most successful model in the post-World War II, where we started out with a military high commissioner who is responsible both to the State Department and the military, but they commanded all the resources until the physical security situation got to a certain level, and then they turned it over to a civilian administrator at that point who cared. So I do think, you know, you've got, you know, logistics, accountability, you know, training and standards. You have to have a way to have a workforce that you can tap into to do that. And I think that's the mitigating technique for preparing for the future. Not that I think that we should be doing this stuff, but just in case we ever have to do this again.
Well, you mentioned Ambassador Jerry Bremer, and he's next on my list. So over to you, Jerry. And I've already introduced you.
Just a brief comment on the nation building. I agree with Jim. The problem with the State Department is the State Department has virtually no experience in managing large programs. That skill rests in the Pentagon, if you're going to look around the foreign affairs community. And I think the idea of looking to a sort of civilian call-up corps to do a lot of the technical things, which we actually did during the time I was in Iraq. Most of the people who were working for me were engineers who knew how to do transportation, people who had experience with the oil industry, people who knew how to deal with electricity. That was a good model, at least for 14 months. It went away, obviously, when the occupation ended. But my question isn't about that. In talking about deterring the North Koreans, neither of you have spoken about the other three countries, other than China, that also need to be persuaded that the deterrence is working: Seoul, Japan, and Taiwan. Because we may we could conceivably come up with a strategy that satisfies us that we have deterred the North Koreans. But if it doesn't satisfy those three countries, they all have obviously a very quick capacity for going nuclear themselves. So how do we make that happen as well? Because if it works against us only, it's not going to succeed.
Yeah, please.
Obviously the new South Korean regime is a bit of an open question, but we did meet with the South Korean envoy when he came here, and we've been following the incoming government very closely, and at least in the short term, knock on wood, there does seem to be, I think, strategic alignment between the United States and South Korea and North Korea. So I actually do think that they see the U.S. deterrence as credible. They kind of see the way forward, at least in the short term, as similarly that the South Koreans aren't pushing to rush back to the negotiating table. They think we need to stay strong. And so, I'm relatively sanguine about U.S.-South Korea in the short term. The U.S.-Japanese relationship, I think, is going amazingly well. I think Abe and Trump have a very strong personal relationship. Talk to Japanese officials and get a real sense of confidence there. I think the Taiwanese are a little nervous. Understandably, we've kind of sent them mixed signals. I get that when I talk to the Taiwanese. I think we could shore that up a bit. And I've always been in the camp that I think we ought to have a more antagonistic relationship with the Chinese, and not to escalate conflict, but I think that's the quickest path to de-escalation of conflict is when the Chinese understand where the true tension points are between us and we respect each other's space better. I think we'll actually have a more stable relationship. And I think the problem now is we still continue to go out of our way looking like how not to antagonize them, and we actually make their job harder of understanding how the strategic balance is going to work out. And so if the United States, I think, was actually a bit more antagonistic across the realm, that we'd actually get to stability with the Chinese a lot faster. And I think the Taiwan relationship is one. And I think we have good historic evidence for this. I think we've shown that whenever the United States is really strong in its security commitments to Taiwan, relations between Taiwan and China actually get better. So I think we ought to be more unambiguous about our support for Taiwan. I think it would make the Taiwanese feel better. And in the end, I think it would get us to a rebalancing of the U.S.-China relationship faster.
Ambassador, I'm just going to say one thing about North Korea policy, and it's partly because I'm concerned here on being the hawk so far. But, and Jim just started to write that a little bit, although I don't necessarily disagree. But I do think that on North Korea policy today, preventive war is less relevant. What's the real debate is, do we stick with the basic contours of an approach where we insist on denuclearization as the only viable deal in the first instance? Or do we accept the possibility of going first for a freeze instead? Freeze is hard to verify. North Koreans aren't going to want us or anybody we know to be part of the verification, because then they got to show all their uranium enrichment sites, some of which we don't know the location of, I don't think. And then how much sanctions relief do we really collectively allow when they're not doing what we insist they should do in the end, which is complete denuclearization? All that's going to make the negotiation really hard, but I think it's a debate we have to have, because this puritanical insistence on zero has gotten us absolutely nowhere through multiple administrations. So whether we blame Clinton, Bush, Obama, whoever, they've all insisted on zero as the only goal, and we've just watched North Korea's arsenal grow. So, also speaking of China, I do think we need to sort of establish that with the Chinese that we will be tough, including vis-a-vis or towards China, in response to their tolerating Kim. But I think that is part of it. And then the other part is to have a credible, more optimistic vision of where the negotiations could go once we collectively convince North Korea they have not much choice. So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
That's precisely my point. If you move to a non-zero strategy, there is a real requirement to make that credible in Tokyo, Seoul, and
Yep.
That was precisely the point I was making. I think, Jim, it's not enough to say the new president of Korea today is warm and fuzzy, because he won't be there forever.
Right.
It's more a strategic question about how our allies in the region will view a move towards a non-zero option.
Right.
And how we make that credible.
Right, but at this point it's just way premature, because we know North Korea has zero interest in any option other than the maintenance of where they are. So, I mean, we could have this great debate about what we're willing to negotiate over, but North Korea is far from ready to negotiate with anybody about anything, and I think everybody gets that.
I'm not necessarily in favor of changing our policy, but I'm saying if you come up with a strategy.
Oh, yeah, fair enough, yeah.
Pyongyang, it also has to work in Tokyo and Taipei.
Absolutely.
So we've got about 25 minutes left, and I've got Jacob, Rob Litwack, Steve Rademacher, Ruth Wedgwood, and President Dimitri Symes, who may well be asking the last question. So and Chairman of the Board, Chuck Boyd, who wants to go last. So there we are.
Well, I only follow what Dov says, so I want to pick up on one of his remarks earlier about the peril, unexpected things happen, or maybe sliding into war. And my question for the panelists is, today President Trump has attacked Qatar and said that, claimed credit for Saudi Arabia's moves and said this could, quote, be beginning of an end to the horror of terrorism. So are we on the verge, or maybe the verge is too strong, but could you conceive a scenario in which we become embroiled in some kind of Sunni Shiite clash by putting ourselves so strongly on the side of the Saudis?
One, no, and two, I never pay attention to Trump's tweets.
The only scenario you could come up with would be if the Qataris, in desperation, go to Iran and ask the Iranians to come in. And now you've got Iran on the Arabian Peninsula, and things could get very ugly. I don't put a very high percentage on that one.
And the only other I think it's a legitimate thing to keep an eye on. We are pretty committed to the success of Iraq. Working with Iraq doesn't really allow us to take sides in a Sunni Shia schism. So I hope that for us is sort of a ballast that prevents us from being drawn too far in the direction you mentioned, although I have it as a concern myself.
Okay, Rob. Is Rob Litwack still back there?
Yep, he sure is.
All right.
Thank you very much. America's overarching foreign policy approach has been integration. And when states integrating into the international system has not been an option, our default alternative has been containment, not preventive war and regime change. The president has tweeted a red line that he will not permit North Korea to attain a capability to strike the United States with a long-range ballistic missile armed with a nuclear warhead. In 3 years, when they attain that capability, there will be the proverbial action-forcing event for the administration, and there it'll have two options. One, contain and deter, or initiate preventive war to deny that capability to North Korea. So if we fast forward to this meeting, and to a more pointed question, how would you see that debate playing out in the Trump administration, their decision-making 3 years from now?
I firmly believe that Trump means what he says. We just have to figure out what he means. I don't interpret that as a clear policy, and I don't think that preventative war is on the table for these guys. I just don't see that in him. Not now, not 3 years from now.
Hey, Rob, I know you thought about this a lot, too. I've been doing a lot of great writing on it. I think that, as you're well aware, there are a number of other variables, including how many long-range missiles might they have? Is it a solid fuel-based missile? Do we know where they'd be as they're being prepared for launch? Could Trump say, for example, at that point, take his earlier tweet and modify it into a policy of, we will never watch North Korea prepare a nuclear-armed ICBM for launch, which is a little, and if we see where they're being prepared, then we actually could act on that policy. And if you declare it in advance, there's a decent chance the North Koreans might actually be deterred. So that would be my guess as to where that debate might go at that point.
Steve? While he's getting the mic, I totally agree with Jim. Tweets, as my good friend Wendy Chamberlain had said, at our age, we all get up at 3 in the morning.
Thanks, Doug. To go back to the issue of preventive war, I think there's been a pretty strong consensus here that's, generally speaking, not a good idea. But I think we all recognize that nuclear weapons, specifically, but maybe weapons of mass destruction more generally, may be a special case. And we've talked about a couple of the examples. And let me just preface my question by saying I wasn't in favor of preventive war on the Korean Peninsula in '94. I'm not in favor of it today. And I'm not here to argue that the Iraq policy of President Bush was brilliantly conceived and brilliantly executed. But
there were the other two examples that were mentioned, the Osirak reactor and the Syria operation in 2007 by Israel against the Syrian reactor. And I'd like to hear our panelists. I think those were not preemptive uses of military force because there was no immediate threat that either of those countries was going to attack Israel. So they would have to fall in the preemptive category. And I guess I would like to hear our panelists comment on whether they think those two operations were misguided, mistaken, or to the contrary, something that we in retrospect, actually think were a good idea. And if the judgment on them isn't negative, then maybe the next question would be, what is the principle then? Is the principle that really we're in favor of things that work and we're against things that don't work? Which maybe isn't a bad principle, but you know, I'm not sure any president's ever going to get up and say, I have this great idea that isn't going to work, but I want to do it anyway. You know, every president's going to say his policies is going to work.
Yeah.
So anyway.
No, I mean, I think the comment I'd like to make is that in Western regimes, you know, signals are very ephemeral, right? So there's no such thing as the United States did this, or the British did this, or the French did this, or the Japanese did this, and now I understand their behavior and I understand what my limits are because the regime changed, the politics changed, the international dynamics changed. So even if those things were, in a sense, meant to send a signal or learn a lesson, what's the half-life of that, right? So I'm not in the camp about, well, we're going to do this and we're going to send a signal to the world, right? Because I don't think that's really a very effective means of statecraft. So, you know, we fire 59 cruise missiles into Syria. Should the world interpret that? I mean, I think even if you're trying to send a signal to the entire world by doing that, that's kind of stupid because the context and everything else is going to change and evolve pretty quickly. And it's just not the best way of statecraft, of using force as kind of a signal sender, unless you're doing unless it's in a very narrow context of a linear relationship between two states over a relatively short period of time. But to kind of, for global signal sending and for kind of, you know, establishing an American practice for all time, and I'm not sure it's terribly effective. Yeah, but right, yeah, I get that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, the way I would respond to that, I would say yes, they were successes. They would have started to interject now into the peace process and other things in the Middle East. But if they would have been even bigger successes if they bought time that had been used to create durable peace, right, and thereby lessening the long-term incentive of other Arab states to have nuclear programs to threaten Israel's existence. I'm not blaming one side or the other in that indictment. So it could still ultimately wind up being an even bigger success than it is so far. Right now it's an interim success in the sense that it's kept Israel secure, helped keep Israel secure for 20, 30 more years than they might have otherwise. It will prove to be a historic success to the extent that the period of relative safety that it's purchased can be used productively.
And I'll go back to the point I made earlier. It was a success because of who they were going after. To compare that situation to, say, going after a Korea that has all that artillery aimed at the south, that will be able to do something. It's got missiles that can reach Japan, and even if they're not armed with nuclear weapons, they can still cause a lot of damage in Japan. I think we're just talking very different contexts here. Okay, I've got Ruth, Dimitri, Chuck Boyd wants to go last. If we have a little bit of time, we'll squeeze Oda in there. Ruth Bedgewood, by the way.
Slightly ancient history, I guess, but I guess I still wonder why we have so easily dismissed missile defense. And I remember the old John Rhinelander, Dick Garwin debate, and Rhinelander was a very good arms controller. Garwin thought there was real capability there. And is he still alive? But I hope he is. But he was not treating it as some kind of lapidary fantasia. It was a real technological capability if we were willing to invest in it. So I think that's something we should look at. One other thing just on nuclear. I'm losing all my proper names as I get older. But the Osirak reactor was the one in Sudan, right?
No, that was the one in Iraq.
Iraq. Oh, so what's the one in Sudan? It was in,
that was the chemical facility that they
right,
thought was nuclear.
Right. And we ended up, it turned out that we induced the Egyptians to actually take part in its destruction by excuse me, I'm screwing this up. There was a sample of its of its malevolent product.
Soil.
And EPNA, right? And one day I was sitting down with the Sudanese ambassador and said, well, what do you think about the embarrassment of having bombed a facility that's supposed to not have had any capability? And what about the sample? And the Egyptian guy said, who do you think gave you the sample? So they had slipped it in to get us to do their bidding because they were pissed that Al-Qaeda was trying to attack Egypt. So some of this attempt at deterrence and punitive response is very tricky to disembowel unless you actually know the ground level movements of the players.
Yeah, and I'll just say this administration is very bullish on missile defense.
Okay, I've got Dimitri, and I think I'll be able to squeeze Oda in, and then, Mr. Chairman, you get the last word.
Well, this is a great discussion. I have learned a lot. First, I absolutely love puritanic insistence on zero. Then I don't look at tweets, right?
Yeah, right.
And the third line, at a certain age, we all wake up at 3 a.m. But I want to go back to puritanic insistence, because I absolutely agree with everything that was said about dangers and problems with preventive war. But let's not be puritanic about that. Is there a point when we have to think about the unthinkable, because other options may be even worse? And what I'm talking